It was supposed to be an ordinary night, but what unfolded under the cold, distant glow of street lamps would become one of the most chilling examples of human silence in modern history. This is the Untold Trace, and I am your host. Let me take you back to the night when the world chose not to listen. March 13th, 1964. Kew Gardens, Queens, New York. It was just past 3 a.m. when 28-year-old Catherine Susan Kitty Genovese finished her shift managing a bar in Hollis. She stepped into her red Fiat and began the short drive home. The streets were empty. The world was still, the kind of stillness that hides 1,000 eyes behind shut windows, and one predator lurking in the dark. Kitty parked her car roughly 100 feet from her apartment building. As she stepped out, high heels clicking against the sidewalk, she had no idea someone was watching her. A man sat inside his car, engine off, cold eyes locked on her every movement. His name was Winston Moseley. He had stalked neighborhoods before, like a vulture circling its prey, but this time the hunt had only just begun. As Kitty walked toward her building, Moseley stepped out of his vehicle and followed her. Quickly, silently. When Kitty realized someone was behind her, it was already too late. She turned, a knife gleamed in the dim light. He lunged. "Help me! Please! Help me!" she screamed into the silent neighborhood. Lights flicked on, curtains shifted, but no one came. A neighbor, startled by the cries, opened his window and shouted into the street, "Leave that girl alone!" Startled, Moseley ran off. Kitty, bleeding, staggered toward the rear of the building, hoping someone would come to her aid. But the night swallowed her cries, and the windows shut once again. Inside one apartment, a man turned back to his bed. In another, a woman looked out briefly, but did nothing more. Someone called a friend to ask what to do, but the phones to police? Silent. 10 minutes passed. Then, Moseley returned. Kitty had collapsed in a narrow corridor near a rear stairwell. Bleeding, weakened, still alive, still hoping. But there was no one, not a single footstep down the stairs. No door creaked open. The world watched and did nothing. Winston Moseley stabbed her again and again, then raped her as she lay dying. He took her wallet, and he left. The first call to police wouldn't come until 3:50 a.m. By the time an ambulance arrived, Kitty Genovese had bled out. She died in the hallway, just steps from safety. Alone. It was a horror story, not only because of what was done to her, but because of what wasn't done for her. In the weeks that followed, New York would erupt in controversy. But that night, the city was silent. Who was Kitty Genovese? Before her name became a national headline, Kitty was just a young woman trying to make a life in New York City. Born in Brooklyn in 1935, she was the oldest of 5 children. After her mother witnessed a murder in their neighborhood in 1954, the family moved to Connecticut. But Kitty stayed behind. She loved the energy of the city. She was fiercely independent, smart, charming, and known for her quick wit and big smile. She worked hard managing a bar and dreamed of one day opening her own Italian restaurant. She lived with her partner, Marianne Zilonko, in a modest apartment in Queens. Back then, the two had to keep their relationship private. Same-sex love was still deeply stigmatized. Kitty was the kind of person who greeted neighbors with a smile, who remembered birthdays, who made people feel seen. She was vibrant, full of life. And in one night, all of it was stolen. The morning after. By the next morning, the police had arrested Winston Moseley, thanks to a sharp-eyed neighbor who reported a suspicious man in the area. Moseley confessed, not just to Kitty's murder, but to 2 other killings and multiple assaults. His motives were as cold as they were chilling. He liked to kill women. It made him feel powerful. But Moseley's confession wasn't the headline. 2 weeks later, the New York Times published a front-page story that would make the case infamous across the globe. 37 who saw murder didn't call the police. The headline read. It claimed that nearly 40 people had watched the murder and done nothing. No one helped. No one cared. The story shocked the world. It was more than a murder now. It was an indictment of society itself. How could dozens of people see a woman stabbed and raped and choose silence? How could humanity fail so spectacularly? But was it true? The number 37 would later be challenged. Some of the so-called witnesses had only heard muffled screams. Others thought it was a lover's quarrel. At least one man did call a friend asking if he should call the police. One neighbor eventually did. Still, none of them helped her directly. Even if the count was exaggerated, the core truth remained undeniable. A woman screamed for her life, and nobody came. A city questions its soul. In the days that followed, opinion columns debated moral decay. Psychologists speculated about urban apathy. Ministers gave sermons about community responsibility. Kitty became a symbol of something broken. The murder of Kitty Genovese wasn't just about one evil man. It was about what happens when good people do nothing. For years, her name would be mentioned in college textbooks, psychology lectures, documentaries, and newspaper retrospectives. But in that moment, in that hallway, Kitty wasn't a lesson or a symbol. She was a woman calling out in pain, waiting for someone, anyone, to answer. The night Kitty Genovese died, the city stayed quiet. No one rushed down the stairs. No hero shouted from the darkness. No hands lifted her to safety. Only silence, cold, heavy, final, and the world would never forget. The headline that shook the world: on March 27, 1964, the New York Times printed a story that changed how the world saw itself. The front page read, "37 who saw murder didn't call the police." The article claimed that Kitty Genovese's cries had echoed through the neighborhood while 37 residents watched the attack unfold. And yet, not one lifted a phone. Not one ran down to help. Not one tried to stop the killer. The story spread like wildfire. Radio shows debated it. College campuses erupted in protest. Politicians cited it as a symbol of growing moral decay in urban America. A single story had placed the city, and perhaps the world, on trial. But what really happened that night? Was the silence truly that absolute, or did the truth hide somewhere in the gray? The anatomy of a neighborhood. Kew Gardens wasn't a chaotic slum or a cold industrial block. It was a middle-class residential neighborhood, a place where people nodded politely to each other in the hallway, kept their windows clean, and minded their business. The building where Kitty lived was shaped like a horseshoe, surrounding a private alley with stairwells and rear entrances. The street she parked on was sparsely lit, and the walls echoed sound easily. That night, her screams pierced that stillness. "Please help me," she cried, over and over. But inside those buildings, uncertainty took hold. Some residents thought it was a drunk couple arguing. Others assumed someone else had already called the police. A few, like Carl Ross, Kitty's neighbor, opened their doors, saw the attacker, and closed them again. Carl Ross, the man who heard everything. Carl Ross was arguably the closest person to Kitty when the attack happened. He lived just down the hallway. He heard the screams. He opened his door and looked out. According to his testimony, he saw Kitty lying on the ground in the rear stairwell, and a man crouched over her. But instead of rushing out, Carl slammed the door shut. He didn't call the police right away. Instead, he phoned a friend to ask what to do. Then he had a drink to calm his nerves. Only after Mosley fled the scene for good did Ross venture out to check on Kitty. By then, it was too late. Carl Ross wasn't a bad man. He was scared, but his fear and his hesitation would become part of a national shame. The myth of the 38. It's important to know this. The now famous 38 witnesses narrative wasn't entirely accurate. Later investigations revealed that most of those people hadn't seen the full attack. Some only heard vague screams. Others thought it had ended when Mosley ran off the first time. Several people did attempt to do something. Joseph Fink, a neighbor, called police, but the call didn't go through properly. Sophia Farrar, Kitty's friend and neighbor, rushed down to help the moment she realized something was wrong. She was the one who cradled Kitty as she died. A few others said they stayed awake, peeking through their blinds, unsure if it was their place to intervene. So why did the New York Times get it wrong? The answer is more complicated than malice. Police reports at the time recorded interviews with dozens of people, many of whom admitted to hearing or seeing fragments of the event. A police officer reportedly told the journalists, "Nearly 40 people heard the screams, and no one did anything." That claim became the backbone of the article. The Times didn't fact-check beyond that point. Thus, the 38 witnesses became the story. Even as evidence emerged to contradict it, the myth endured. Why? Because it felt true in a disturbing way. Because the idea that society could be so indifferent struck a nerve deeper than the facts themselves. Fear, apathy, or something worse. What made so many people hesitate? Psychologists would later argue that the human brain often defaults to diffusion of responsibility in public situations. When more people are present, individuals assume someone else will take action. It's not coldness, it's confusion, paralysis, and fear. Some neighbors feared retaliation. Others didn't want to get involved. Many thought, it's probably nothing. Or worse, someone else will do something. The reality is that silence isn't always born of cruelty. Sometimes it's fear wearing 1,000 disguises. But for Kitty, it made no difference. Every second of hesitation was a second of pain she endured alone. The blame game begins. After the Times article, the blame spread like wildfire. Talk shows labeled the neighbors cowards. Clergy condemned the moral decay of modern society. Columnists asked whether New Yorkers had lost their souls. In truth, the city wasn't unique. Experiments around the world would soon prove that this phenomenon wasn't limited to Queens. The bystander effect had a name, and it had always been with us. But Kitty Genovese gave it a face. Sophia Farrar, a flicker of humanity. Amidst the condemnation and analysis, one name should never be forgotten. Sophia Farrar. She was a friend of Kitty's and lived one floor above. When Sophia heard the commotion, she didn't hesitate. She rushed out of her apartment, barefoot and in her nightgown, and found Kitty bleeding in the hallway. She cradled her in her arms and cried out for help. Sophia later said, "I held her. I begged her to hold on. I told her she'd be okay." But Kitty's body had already gone limp. Her last breath was barely a whisper. Sophia wasn't mentioned in the original Times piece. Her courage was buried under the wave of shame. In a neighborhood haunted. In the decades since, many of Kitty's neighbors carried that night like a shadow. Some insisted they didn't hear anything. Others admitted they heard screams, but thought it wasn't serious. A few refused to speak about it at all. One resident, interviewed years later, broke down in tears. "I thought about going down," he said, "but I was scared. I didn't want to die too." Guilt, shame, defensiveness. These emotions lingered long after the crime scene tape came down. What makes a witness? Is it simply what you see, or is it what you choose to do when you see it? That night, dozens of people heard Kitty scream. Some saw her collapse, some looked away. Others froze. One woman ran to her. But in the collective stillness of that moment, something inside our society broke. In the shadows of those windows, the silence became deafening. The morning after, a nation reflects. Kitty Genovese's murder wasn't just a tragedy. It was a mirror, and what the world saw in that mirror was horrifying. A city that had failed to protect a woman, a community that turned its back, and a society that had become, perhaps, too comfortable with apathy. The New York Times article catapulted the case into global conversation, but it did more than just report a crime. It exposed something intangible, something chilling. That in moments of emergency, ordinary people might not act, not because they are cruel, but because of something deeper, something human. This question, why didn't anyone help Kitty Genovese, would not go unanswered. Enter psychology. Latane and Darley. In the wake of the headlines, two social psychologists, Bibb Latane and John Darley, became fixated on the case. Both men taught at Columbia University and were deeply troubled by what had happened, or rather, what hadn't happened. They saw in Kitty's story not just a murder, but a mystery. Why had no one intervened? Why had so many people hearing the screams done nothing? Were these people heartless? Or was there a mechanism behind their inaction? Their curiosity birthed a series of experiments that would change psychology forever. The birth of the bystander effect. Layton and Darley began a series of groundbreaking experiments to test how people reacted to emergencies, depending on whether they were alone or in a group. In one now famous study, participants were placed in a room that slowly began to fill with smoke. When a person was alone, they almost always reported the smoke quickly. But when three people were in the room together and the others appeared unconcerned, almost no one reported the smoke at all. They waited. They hesitated. They looked at each other for cues, and the smoke kept pouring in. The researchers had uncovered something startling. The more people who are present during an emergency, the less likely any one person is to take action. They called it the bystander effect, diffusion of responsibility. When everyone waits, the bystander effect is powered by a psychological principle called diffusion of responsibility. In a group setting, individuals often feel less pressure to act because they assume someone else will do it. The responsibility is shared, diluted, and ultimately ignored. In Kitty's case, the theory suggested that the presence of so many other residents may have created a false sense of security. Each person might have thought, someone else will call the police. Someone else will help. Surely someone else already has. But in reality, no one had. And so Kitty lay bleeding alone in that hallway. The power of social proof, freezing in the crowd. Another layer to the bystander effect is social proof, the idea that people look to others to decide how to behave in ambiguous situations. Okay, in Kitty's case, some neighbors who peered out into the dark and saw no one else reacting may have taken that inaction as a sign that everything was under control. This is human psychology working against us. It's the same instinct that keeps people frozen in place during disasters, looking to see what others are doing before making a move. It's not evil, it's instinctual, but it can be deadly. The real-world consequences. The impact of Layton and Darley's work went far beyond academic journals. Their findings forced society to rethink how we train people to respond to emergencies. They inspired new approaches in public safety, law enforcement, and community response systems. Most notably, Kitty's case contributed directly to the creation of the 911 emergency system, established 4 years later in 1968. Before 911, calling the police wasn't a simple task. You had to know the number of the local precinct. Many people simply didn't. After Kitty, that changed. Now one number could connect anyone to help instantly. Her death sparked a revolution in how help could be summoned and how lives could be saved, rewriting the rules. What we now know. Thanks to the bystander effect, we now understand that emergencies in public spaces demand a call to action. Today, people are taught that if you witness an emergency, assume no one else will help and take action yourself. Modern emergency training often includes this directive. Don't say, someone call 911. Point to a specific person and say, you call 911 now. This breaks the diffusion. It assigns responsibility. It saves lives. Kitty's story became more than a warning. It became a manual on how not to respond. Criticism and reassessment. Over the years, as new information surfaced, critics began to question the original story that sparked all this. Scholars revisited the Kitty Genovese case and realized that the number of witnesses was likely exaggerated. Many people didn't fully understand what they were hearing or seeing. Some did try to help in small ways. And yet, the bystander effect remains very real. Even if 38 people didn't knowingly ignore Kitty's screams, the event illuminated how easily an action spreads and how dangerous it can be. It's a painful paradox. A flawed narrative led to accurate science. Modern echoes of silence. Kitty's legacy echoes in tragedy still. In 1995, a woman was attacked on a subway platform in Chicago. Passengers watched. Some turned away. No one helped. In 2011, a Chinese toddler named Yue Yue was run over in Guangdong province. At least 18 people passed her by on the street before someone finally intervened. She died from her injuries. The footage shocked the world. Even now, in an age of smartphones and constant surveillance, The bystander effect hasn't disappeared. Sometimes people film an emergency before they help. Sometimes they don't help at all. Kitty's story was not a one-time anomaly. It was a preview of what happens when human instincts are left unchecked. In the silence that followed Kitty's screams, the world asked, how could this happen? The answer was not simple. It was buried deep inside us, wired into our fear, our uncertainty, our search for social cues. But once uncovered, it became a truth we could confront. Her death didn't just change New York. It changed human psychology. It showed us the danger of waiting, the danger of watching, the danger of believing that someone else will act. Because when everyone waits, no one does. The arrest. March 19th, 1964. Just 6 days after Kitty's murder, a routine burglary report led to a break in the case. A man named Winston Moseley had been spotted removing a television from a neighbor's home in daylight. Suspiciously calm and evasive during police questioning, he was brought in for further investigation. At first, the officers expected nothing more than a petty thief, but what came next stunned even hardened detectives. During the interrogation, Moseley confessed to something much darker. Not just the burglary, not just the theft, but the murder of Kitty Genovese. And he didn't stop there. With a chilling lack of remorse, he confessed to 2 other murders, to numerous rapes, to stalking women late into the night just for the thrill of it. His words were clinical, cold, detailed. In a matter-of-fact tone, he recounted Kitty's final moments. How he watched her, followed her. How he returned to finish what he started. And how, when he left, he felt satisfied. Who was Winston Moseley? Well, to the outside world, Winston Moseley was an ordinary man. He was a 29-year-old married father of 2, living in Ozone Park, Queens. He worked as a tab operator and was considered by many to be intelligent and soft-spoken. He had no criminal record, no glaring signs of violence, no trail of warning signs that screamed, killer. But beneath that normal exterior, something twisted had taken root. Moseley told detectives he felt a compulsion to hurt women, that he had an overwhelming urge to kill, that he'd drive around for hours, sometimes all night looking for a victim. And when he found one, he didn't hesitate. Kitty wasn't his first, and she wouldn't have been his last. Other victims. During his confession, Moseley admitted to the murder of Annie Mae Johnson, a 24-year-old black woman whom he shot and burned in her apartment weeks before Kitty's death. The crime had gone largely unnoticed by the media at the time, partly because of race and location. It wasn't front-page news. He also confessed to murdering Barbara Kralik, a 15-year-old who had been stabbed multiple times in her parents' home. That case had initially led to the arrest of another suspect, who came close to being wrongly convicted. Moseley's detailed confession exonerated the innocent and laid bare a terrifying reality. There was a predator moving freely through New York, hunting women without pattern or remorse. The courtroom and the monster within. In June 1964, Winston Moseley stood trial for the murder of Kitty Genovese. The prosecution painted a picture of a calculating, cold-blooded killer. The jury was shown how Moseley stalked his victim, retreated, and returned, all while neighbors did nothing. The case became more than a trial of one man. It became a trial of a city's conscience. Moseley's defense attempted an insanity plea, claiming he was mentally ill and unable to understand the consequences of his actions. But psychiatrists disagreed. Moseley was not insane. He was aware. He was deliberate. He knew exactly what he was doing and why. On June 15, 1964, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. The sentence brought a temporary sense of closure. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But the story didn't end there. Escape and more horror. In 1967, just 3 years after his conviction, Winston Moseley did something that would reignite fear across New York. While being transported to a hospital for a minor procedure, he managed to overpower a guard, steal his weapon, and escape custody. For 3 days, he was on the run. But what he did during that time was even more horrifying. Moseley broke into a home in Buffalo, New York, and held a woman and her daughter hostage. He raped the mother while her daughter was locked in another room. He then stole a car, fled, and was eventually caught after a brief standoff. The escape proved what everyone feared. This was a man who would never stop. His sentence was commuted from death to life in prison, partly due to the growing legal challenges to capital punishment in the state. And so, Winston Moseley would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Prison life and parole pleas. Moseley didn't fade into obscurity. Over the years, he wrote letters to newspapers, filed appeals, and gave bizarre interviews claiming he was a changed man. He expressed remorse, but often in self-serving language. In 1977, he wrote a letter to the New York Times, describing himself as a victim of society and insisting that prison had made him a man. The public recoiled. For the families of his victims, it was salt in a never-healing wound. He applied for parole more than a dozen times. Each time he was denied. Each time the memories of Kitty's final moments were brought back into the headlines. Death in a cell. On March 28, 2016, Winston Moseley died in prison at the age of 81. He had served more than 50 years behind bars. To many, it was a quiet end for a man who had brought so much terror. A whimper to follow a scream. But his name still carries weight, a reminder of how evil can wear a quiet smile, how monsters don't always announce themselves, and how one man's darkness forced the world to examine its own. Contrasts and cruel ironies. It's difficult to reconcile the image of Kitty Genovese, vibrant, ambitious, beloved, with that of Winston Moseley, soft-spoken, intelligent, calculating. She represented everything joyful about life. He was the quiet rot beneath the surface. She built dreams. He destroyed them. She wanted to open a restaurant. He wanted control, power, blood. Her story forced us to confront silence. His story forces us to confront evil. In every crime, there's a face behind the fear. But Winston Moseley wasn't just a murderer. He was a mirror into something darker. A man who walked among us unnoticed, who smiled, worked, raised children, and yet harbored a hunger that no one saw coming. He didn't just take Kitty's life, he shattered the illusion of safety in ordinary spaces, in quiet neighborhoods, in well-lit streets. And for a moment, he made the world go silent. The woman beyond the headlines, Catherine Susan Genovese, known to everyone as Kitty, was born on July 7, 1935, in Brooklyn, New York. The eldest of 5 children in a tight-knit Italian-American family, Kitty had a natural charisma that made her instantly likable. Her smile was wide, her eyes expressive. She had a sarcastic sense of humor, a love of dancing, and a fire for independence that set her apart. When her mother witnessed a violent crime in their neighborhood, the Genovese family decided to leave Brooklyn for Connecticut. But Kitty stayed behind. She was 19, fearless, and ready to build a life on her own terms. She worked various jobs, secretarial work, bartending, and eventually became the manager of a bar in Hollis, Queens. She worked hard, often pulling long hours into the night. But she didn't mind. She was saving up to open her own Italian restaurant. That was her dream, her future. She shared an apartment with her girlfriend, Mary Ann Zalonko. In 1964, being openly gay was dangerous. The couple lived quietly, presenting as roommates to the world, but sharing a private love behind closed doors. They made a life together, tucked into a small apartment in Kew Gardens. Kitty had friends, she had plans, she had love, she had a voice, and it was stolen. A brother's mission. Bill Genovese. For decades after Kitty's murder, her younger brother, Bill Genovese, lived in the shadow of that night. He was 16 when she died. It devastated him. It fractured his family. His parents never recovered. Kitty's father rarely spoke of her again. Her mother couldn't bear to say her name without crying. Bill later enlisted in the Marines, served in Vietnam, and lost both his legs in combat. But even then, he said nothing hurt more than losing his sister. Years later, he decided to reclaim her story. In 2015, he produced a powerful documentary titled The Witness. The film chronicled his personal journey to uncover the truth of what really happened the night Kitty died. Not the media version, not the myth, the real Kitty, the real story. Bill tracked down surviving witnesses, police officers, neighbors, anyone who might remember that night. What he found shocked him. Many of the Wood's 38 witnesses never even saw the full attack. Some only heard faint screams. Some misunderstood what was happening. Some tried to help but didn't know how. The media narrative, he realized, had taken on a life of its own, at the cost of Kitty's true legacy. The damage of the myth. The infamous headline, 37 who saw murder didn't call the police, turned Kitty into a symbol of urban apathy. Her name became shorthand for indifference, for failure. But that myth reduced her to a case, not a person. Bill Genovese spent years trying to undo that damage. In interviews, he often said, "I want the world to remember Kitty not as a victim, but as a sister, a daughter, a lover, a dreamer." The documentary, The Witness, was not just a retelling of events. It was an act of restoration, a way to give Kitty her voice back. Marianne Zilonko, the woman who loved Kitty. For decades, Marianne remained silent. The media never interviewed her. The public never knew her side. But in The Witness, she finally spoke. She described Kitty as funny, affectionate, and fiercely loyal. They shared a life together, cooking meals, going out dancing, listening to music late into the night. Marianne said Kitty was the kind of person who made others feel seen, who lit up a room without trying. She also shared her guilt. On the night of the murder, she was home sleeping. She didn't hear the screams. She didn't know until the police arrived the next morning. "I should have been there," she said through tears. "I should have helped her." Her voice, raw with pain, added a layer of humanity to a story often buried under headlines. It reminded the world Kitty was loved, deeply, a legacy that saved lives. Though Kitty's life was cut short, the impact of her death rippled across generations. Her story sparked reforms in emergency response systems, most notably the development of 911, which was implemented just 4 years later. Before that, people had to look up specific police precinct numbers, a process that wasted precious time in an emergency. Kitty's case showed the world just how fatal that delay could be. Her name also became central in psychology, criminology, and law. Every college student who studies the bystander effect, every emergency responder who learns crowd dynamics, and every social policymaker who thinks about collective responsibility knows her name. She became the reason people were taught, if you see something, say something. She became the face that challenged silence. And though she never lived to see it, she saved lives. The rewriting of history. In the years that followed, the New York Times came under scrutiny for its original reporting. In 2016, more than 50 years later, the paper published a rare and public reassessment, acknowledging the errors in the 38 witnesses story and the damage it caused to Kitty's memory. While not an outright retraction, the piece recognized that the narrative had been shaped more by drama than truth. For the Genovese family, it was a small but necessary step toward justice. Still, many believe the damage can never be fully undone. Kitty's name lives on. Today there are scholarships in her name, memorials, courses, panels, documentaries. She has become a symbol not just of inaction, but of action, of what can happen when we learn from the past. The Kitty Genovese Foundation works to raise awareness about crime prevention, victim advocacy, and the power of community response. Her brother Bill often speaks to students and civic groups, telling his sister's story not with anger, but with purpose, with love, with the unshakable belief that she didn't die in vain. Hunter, the final hours remembered. In the final scene of The Witness, Bill visits the very hallway where Kitty died. He stands in silence, then kneels, touching the ground where his sister took her last breath. It's a haunting moment. Not of rage, not of grief, but of presence. For the first time, it feels like Kitty isn't just remembered. She's heard. Kitty Genovese was not a symbol. She was a daughter, a friend, a lover, a sister. She lived with hope in her heart and dreams in her mind. And though her life ended in silence, her story has spoken louder than she ever could have imagined. She taught the world that apathy can kill, but that awareness can save. And while the world may have gone silent that night, Kitty's voice echoes still.